At last. You guys have been incredibly patient. Really appreciate that. As we are anticipating lots of interesting things today. And we're so happy that you're here to join us for the 5th day of the annual India Rural Colloquy. It's the most comprehensive series of conversations and events about rural India. And when I say comprehensive, I mean 8 days and 5 states, which you have to admit is pretty impressive. Why rural India? Of course, we all know that India is progressing and thriving, but the question that keeps most people in this room up at night is, will rural India be part of that growth story? It should be. After all, 2/3 of India's massive population live in rural areas. And it surprises a lot of urban Indians to find out that the biggest employment sector for Indian women is agriculture. But are these women part of the Viksit Bharat? Are they part of the growth story? They should be. They certainly have the drive and tenacity. They certainly have the agility and adaptability that requires you to progress to the next level. In fact, their dreams and aspirations are at the heart of this organization, Transform Rural India, and many organizations in India, who are full of people who work tirelessly to help empower rural women to have the same opportunities as their urban cousins. And while a multidimensional approach to rural development is essential to create real systems change in rural India, without a doubt, one of the most crucial pieces to that puzzle is employment, money, stability, and the dignity that comes with having a secure and sustainable livelihood. And helping both rural women and men at an early age find sustainable employment and even a self-starting enterprise is essential. And that's why we're here today. And that's why the India Rural Colloquy 2024 has commissioned and is releasing in just a few minutes a vital report on the state of rural youth employment. And it's not only insightful, but some of the findings might actually surprise you. So we want you to sit tight as I now invite some wonderful people to come up to the stage, please. First, I would like to invite the co-authors of this report, Anu Mehta, who is not just the co-author, but is the part of the Global Development Incubator and heads the work at the Global Opportunity Youth Network, which was co-created by the Aspen Institute, a think tank, and the GDI, connecting young people to dignified employment. Anna, would you please come up, and can we give her a round of applause? Yes, please have a seat for now, or actually we're gonna make you stand. Okay, because this stage is about to get very crowded. So you stand. I would like to also invite your co-author of this report, Sandeep Ghosh, who's the director of the Development Intelligence Unit. Hold your applause a second. I have a very long bio to read. 33 years in development, and he says, and I quote, that's why he has his gray hair. He has held many senior management positions with global commercial research agencies and served most of the multilateral and bilateral agencies in India and abroad, actually. He has loads of experience, not just working with data, but working with government to help apply that data to become great policy. So please now let's introduce Sandeep Ghosh to the stage. And of course, I would like to invite my very esteemed colleague who has just entered the room. That would be Anish Kumar, who is the co-lead of TRI. Hold your applause, hold your applause. The co-lead and co-creator of TRI. And if you have not met Anish, then you have not met one of the most passionate people working in rural development in India today. And they would like to introduce and bring onto stage all the people that helped write this report and research on this report. So please, would the other people responsible for this wonderful report come to the stage and let's unveil it. Let's get some good photos. Peter, you're not coming, huh? The dramatic unveiling. Thank you. Once all of them are unwrapped, let's, can I take? Okay, and now let's have a photo. Do we need to take anything else from in front? A photo of them holding the report. Big smiles. Wonderful, thank you. And now we will hear a presentation of the key findings. As I say, some of them might surprise you, from Anu and Sandeep. If you guys would please, now you can take a seat. Okay. And open the mics and let us know what's in this report. Do you want to stand here? All right, please.
I'll just quickly set the context before I hand over to Sandeep to go over some of the data. The reason we did this report is that youth employment and including young people in the workforce is not only an Indian opportunity challenge, it's a global opportunity and challenge. We have many, many young people. It's peak youth population globally. We have young people that are increasingly being affected by changing climate, conflict, etc., that are affected and hence have to drop out of the workforce. Also, nature of work is changing, etc., etc. So that's kind of like the global context. If we zoom in on India, we also have the youngest working age population here. We have a growing economy, but young people are disconnected from that growth. And how do we make sure that young people are part of this growth story is the big question that we have to answer. The first step is really to listen to young people themselves and to understand what they want, what their challenges are, what their aspirations are, what they feel that they need in order to be able to succeed in the workforce. And that's essentially what we've tried to do over here. I will, with that, hand over to Sandeep to talk about a little bit of the report and some of the findings that we've come across.
Yeah, thanks, Anu. Thanks once again. It's a pleasure to be part of such an august audience. I'm going to take you through some of the highlights of the report. You'll find the report if you just go outside and click on the scan the QR code. The entire report is already online. You can read that at your convenience. Just wanted to give you an idea about the length and breadth of the coverage. It covered 22 states, over 5,000 what we call opportunity youths aged between 18 and 35. We deliberately wanted to hear the experiences of both men and women. Therefore, we had a quota sample, which is 50-50. It was a telephonic survey. As you know, that DIU uses the Samodhi panel platform to do all its surveys. And it was all done in the vernacular, 37 telecallers posted across different states who actually went day in and day out to churn out this data within a month's time. The workforce participation, before I get into that, just wanted to let you know the three different types of people who were interviewed. Number one was people who are currently in the paid workforce. And by workforce, I mean people who actually get paid for the work that they do. So there were a bunch of people who are part of the paid workforce, but are looking for a change. The second category was people who had at one time been part of the paid workforce, but are no longer working and want to come back into the workforce. Typically, there would be a lot of cases used to work, had got married, discontinued work, or discontinued work because of their children, and wanted to come into the workforce again. And the third category was first-time entrants into the workforce who had never worked before. Again, most of the analysis is broken up not only by gender, but also by age, looking specifically at the 18 to 25 age group and the 26 to 35 age group. As you can see, intuitively, it was if you can see the dark blue color, you can see most of the male in the sample were, I mean, the sample was heavily skewed in people who were participated at one time or are currently participating in the workforce. Most of the male were in that category. Unfortunately, this is the reality in India, where there is a huge amount of disguised unemployment. In any case, there's a lot of far few women who are part of the paid workforce to begin with. Interestingly, just under 50% of the people in the survey claim that they was part of the primary income of their household was agriculture. As you will see later on, I don't want to jump the gun here, but not many people whose primary income comes from agriculture actually wanted to remain in agriculture. A lot of the people parents who are in agriculture were not looking at agriculture as an option even for their children. Some of the main and key things which a lot of these youth talked about in terms of them entering the workforce, the barriers that they talked about as lack of financial and moral support from family. The moral support issue came a lot with the women. Women who wanted to enter the workforce. A lot of them, one of the biggest barriers that they felt was the previous generation, their parents, their grandparents putting a barrier saying that we don't really want you to go out there and join the paid workforce. This is also part of the cultural norms and traditions. You can actually club them together as the same thing. And lack of opportunities, of course, in rural areas. This is a rural study. Please remember that this is not an urban study. This is a rural study, and there was the opportunities that present in an urban areas are far more than it is in the rural areas. Another interesting thing is that, as I said before, most of the people who are engaged in work actually wanted to change. Nobody was really 85%, 70 to 85% of the people who are currently working was looking for a change in their job. And where they wanted to actually go to is they wanted to go small manufacturing, retail, or trading business. They wanted to get into salaries. These were the major preferences as far as jobs are concerned. The type of inputs that they were all looking for in terms of a change in occupation had to do this is surprising, not having to do with skilling. I know the government of India, and I mean most of the not just the government but the non-governmental world has a lot of stress on skilling. But if you went and talked to these youth aged again 18 to 35, skilling was not going to be, or training was not one of their major wants as far as a change in job was concerned. Most of them was looking for capital. They're saying that if you give us access to capital, we'll sort out what needs to be done. Aspirations and preferences across current employment. People who have never worked before wanted to go to government, but here I wanted to highlight, if you can just look at the table on the left-hand side, this is very interesting as far as we were concerned. We thought that that women would be much more inclined towards a secured government job or a salaried job. Intuitively, that's what you think is going to be the answer. That was not the case. While 30% of the male were looking for government salaried job, only 15% of the women were looking for salaried government job. On the other hand, if you look at be self-employed via vocational trade, it is most of the women who actually wanted to go and learn a vocational trade and open a very small business of their own based on that vocational trade. And less than 2% of the male actually wanted to do that. Most of the male, if not in salaried, wanted to go into running small manufacturing trades or retail business, things like opening opening a mobile repairing shop and so on and so forth, or opening a shop like a kirana ka dukan and so on and so forth, which is not so much of a taker as far as the women are concerned. But the fact remains that in every instance, especially if you're looking at people who are never worked before, or those who are actively looking for work, people who have never worked before or who have walked out of the workforce, nearly 100% of them right now are actually looking for work. Varying preferences, again, looking at youth across age groups. If you look at the younger age group, as it shows, there is a distinct difference with what the older generation wants and what the younger generation wants. Vocational trade, getting into a vocational trade on doing business is something which the younger generation really wanted to do. It's the older generation which wanted the security of a salaried job. So that's what, it's a clear difference which was coming between the two age groups. If you look at access and awareness around training, access and awareness around training, you can see access to training was abysmally low. If you look at the type of if you look at among currently working or who have never worked, not even 10% of the people have accessed any of the government training programs. Their recall is only on a few of the government training programs. Most even haven't even heard about DDU, GKY, or RCETI. Youth views on migrating to work. This is again another counterintuitive finding. We thought that women would want to stay at home and work, wanted to work in their own village or within commutable distance, and male, it would not matter. They were going to go and work anywhere they want. Should I stop? Anywhere they want, and but that was not the case. Even 60% of the male gentry, as far as the sample is concerned, wanted work which was fairly close to home or within commutable distance. In agriculture, as I said before, currently there were not too much of takers. One of the major reasons was low. I mean, all of us know the reasons: low productivity, insufficient land, and so on and so forth. But they were very vocal, and they could articulate quite well what sort of inputs that they want if they want to stay in agriculture or take up agriculture as a viable option going forward. And you can see a lot of it has to do with skilling, but even more has to do with financial support. Aspiration and challenges under entrepreneurship. Well, there was a bit of reluctance towards entrepreneurship and self-employment, primarily because there are lack of skills or mindset. But most importantly, a lot of them were saying that nobody in our household has actually done business before. So we are very hesitant to take up and do something. They again could articulate quite well what sort of support they needed. They needed support for upgrading skills, financial support, mostly technical support, and support in upgrading machinery. I'm going to leave this to Anu now to wrap it up towards the end.
So I'll wrap this up quickly. I just wanted to talk about 5 key insights that came out of the report. One is that the rates of workforce participation that came through the report sample are in congruence with data that's been put out into the public sector by different government departments. The second thing is that income aspiration varies very, very much across age group, across gender, etc. But it was between 13,000 rupees a month and 33,000 rupees per month. Like Sandeep said, migration was not a preference. Well over half the sample, so 60% male, 70% female, said that they preferred to find work in the district or even or close to the district where they could commute back home, even when income was 20 to 30% lower, which is interesting because that then creates much potential for job creation at the district. However, agriculture and entrepreneurship, which are key labor absorption pathways, are not aspirational for young people in their current state, but young people were able to articulate and say what they wanted in order to make these pathways aspirational. So that's kind of like key action points that we can have on the ground. These are key insights. I will just quickly take a few minutes to talk about some kind of possible solutioning. So in short, there's no single solution that can work. There's a whole range of solutions that we need. Young people move between opportunities very much like we do in our careers, and they gather skills across these different opportunities that will then help towards a little bit more progression. It's also the fact that it cannot be only young people who are skilled for the workforce, but there also needs to be increased economic opportunity at the village. So how do we take the economy to the people rather than having young people migrate? That's kind of like the second piece of thinking around the work that needs to be done. The fact also that district is a actionable and measurable unit of change, and that we need many different types of things. We need convergence. We need to think about future of work, key sectors, cross-cutting themes. How do we include youth voice? How do we think about M&E learning, et cetera, et cetera? And all of this needs to be happening at the state at the same time to be able to work, because it's interconnected issues and opportunity. And so the solution also has to be multidimensional. Labor absorption planning is very, very critical. So how do you look at the total number of young people in a district and then think about where these young people can find jobs? This is a sample that we had done in MP in Bardwani. And then how much work do we really need? It's till we get to that saturation point where there is decreased investment and then the level of impact keeps increasing. And this happens only when we work with enough young people so that there are services that are available for all young people, whether we directly work with them or not. And I will end with this to say that there are 5 big ideas to really shift youth employment at scale in the rural areas. One is to think of district as unit of change. The second one is to increase rural economic opportunity. The third one is to think of many, many different solutions that can facilitate labor absorption at a large scale, critically including youth voice and aspirations, which we've tried to do through this report. And then also convergence of youth programming across different government departments, non-government work, private sector, et cetera, et cetera. So just these 5 big ideas. And then this piece is the work that we are doing on the ground to bring all of this different place-based approach into these districts. But we'll talk about that in the panel that follows this. Yeah. Okay. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. I really like reports that are not only full of data, that data is often unintuitive and surprising, but also offer solutions. So thank you so much. We're going to have a very interesting panel discussion about this report and more after we have, with no more hesitation, our keynote speaker, where we're going to dig into the aspirations and challenges facing young rural Indians and how we can better tap into their talents and help India reach the potential of its great demographic dividend. And so it is our great pleasure to welcome as our keynote speaker, Dr. V. Anantha Nageshwaran, a distinguished economist and author who's been serving as the Chief Economic Advisor to the Government of India since 2022. Dr. Nageshwaran brings a wealth of experience, both from the academic and corporate sectors, having held significant roles from the Global Chief Investment Officer at Julius Baer's Bank and the Regional Head of Investment Consulting and Global Strategist at Credit Suisse in Asia. He's also served as the Currency Economist at UBS. His academic contributions are also notable, having taught microeconomics at various prestigious institutions, including IIM and Korea University, where he is a distinguished visiting professor. And as if that's not enough, when he has time, he also is an author and a columnist, including a weekly column, no less, for Ment, and co-authoring several influential books like The Rise of Finances, Causes, Consequences, and Cures, and The Economics of Derivatives. Dr. Nageshwaran, welcome. Thank you so much. And we would like you to have a seat. We are just going to remove the chairs very swiftly so that there is only one of you. Which do you prefer? Standing? Okay. Then please watch your step.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and sincere thanks to the Transforming Rural India people for thinking of me and inviting me to share my thoughts with you. I haven't had the chance to go through the report yet because it is not formally launched, and I saw the last few slides, and I think they were quite relevant. Although the brief given to me is to talk to you about the state of the economy, in particular, the state of the youth in the country, the labor aspirations and how to create jobs, etc. Barely 2 weeks ago, we brought out the economic survey. I think some of you might have had a chance to take a look at it. And also some of you might have been looking at the headlines as they are flashing by this afternoon as to what's happening in a neighborhood, etc. So obviously, this is an important issue for countries which have a large youth segment in their overall population and where the per capita income is still in the lower middle income category, such as ours. So it's important, as one of the few slides I happened to see after I entered pointed out, that the youth want to, even if agriculture or entrepreneurship are not something that they look at it ordinarily as an option, they are not averse to looking at it, provided there is some technical skill, there is some hand-holding, and there is some support, etc. given. I think it's perfectly understandable, and I'll come to that a bit later. But first, I think we need to always, when it comes to economics, when it comes to social phenomena, we need to understand the context in which some of these things occur. And employment as a subject, while it's often the case that whether it is the commentators or whether it is experts or the public, they look up to the government. We all know that economic activity largely takes place outside the government, in the private sector, in the society, and governments provide the playing field, the rules of the game, facilitation in terms of infrastructure, which includes health, connectivity, digital, physical, primary education, and law and order, and a legislative framework, rules and regulations for the conduct of commerce or interaction between members of society, between individuals and institutions, etc. So governments provide all the paraphernalia under which economic activity happens. So that's a canopy under which economic activity happens. And it is the economic activity which is captured, whether it is a very appropriate indicator or not, it is captured by the gross domestic product. Whether we like it or not, as is attributed to Churchill for having said that democracy is the worst form of government, but for all others, you could say the same thing about GDP as an indicator. You might say GDP is the worst form of indicator of economic activity, but for all others, you could say that. Because at the end of the day, it is about capturing the direction in which the economy is going. Even if you know that even with all the statistical improvements we have had, it is still an estimate. And it was conceptualized at the time when it was easy to count things that are being made. And today, a lot of things are not countable, as they say, what can be measured doesn't count, and what counts may not be measurable, right? So all these limitations being there, at the end of the day, it does capture the trend in which a country is progressing. And more importantly, and some of you may have seen the website of Professors Tyler Cowen and Alex Tabarrok, which used to be called Marginal Revolution University, mruniversity.com. I think it might have undergone a name change, but even if you type mruniversity.com, you will be taken to the most current version of it, which is a self-learning site for micro and macroeconomics. And there they show you that while you may not like GDP per se, but GDP has historically, not just last 1 or 2 decades, but historically correlated with things that we care about. The things that we care about, such as infant mortality, life expectancy, health outcomes, maternal mortality rates, etc. Many of these things, or even for that matter, happiness, all these things do indeed correlate with GDP. So you may not like GDP, you may appreciate its shortcomings, all that is well accepted. That's why I said it may not be the best indicator or probably the worst indicator, but for all others. So the point I'm trying to drive at is ultimately one of the best ways in which we generate opportunities for people, whether it is entrepreneurship or employment. It is about creating and sustaining economic growth. Everything else follows from that. Because you need to have a pie that is growing to be even able to consider distributing that pie equitably. There has to be a pie to distribute to start with. So in that regard, let me just take you back a couple of decades. Early part of the new millennium, there was coming out of 9/11. coming out of the technology sector, which burst forth spectacularly in the late 90s, internet, telecommunications, media, and then the stock market, associated stock market bubble burst in the US, as it may be happening right now as we speak. With respect to artificial intelligence or the chip sector at the moment, different points in time, you always have different fads and fashions in the stock markets, and they do come and go. And human beings always are prone to repeating these cycles, no matter how much we learn about them or read about them, but because memories fade, and that is both a good and a bad thing. Otherwise, human beings will either wallow in too much pessimism forever or too much optimism forever. So anyway, the point is, at the beginning of the decade, we had this collapse of the technology sector bubble in the stock markets. 9/11 happened, and then, of course, the US went into Iraq, etc. But then from 2003 onwards, there was a sustained global economic boom, partly result of low interest rates in the developed world, but partly due to many other factors. BRICS became a fashion. People thought India would take over from China in terms of being the global growth engine, etc. And we did grow at 8 to 9% per annum for about 5 years. And then the 2008 financial crisis happened. In between this period of high growth in India, banking sector, developing countries traditionally rely on banking sector for its growth, financing growth. Capital markets are predominantly to be seen in Anglo-Saxon countries. Even continental Europe doesn't rely so much on capital markets as they rely on bank funding. So what happened was India's bank assets as a percentage of GDP was languishing between 25 to 30% of GDP between 1980s and 1990s. Suddenly, in the 2000s, in the first decade, it jumped from 28% of GDP to 56, 58% of GDP in one decade. So imagine a ratio doubling within a decade. Naturally, the numerator must be growing at double the rate of denominator, which is the GDP, which in turn, the nominal GDP, not real GDP, nominal GDP was growing at more than 15% or averaging 15% in the first decade, which means bank credit must have been growing close to 30% of GDP. No wonder we had a bad debt problem in the second decade. See, so it's one thing to say that a child which is 8, 9 years old has a growth phase which would last until he or she turns 18, but you can't compress that growth phase into a few years. It needs to take that 9 to 10 years for it to get to the height and the weight and the size that would be expected of that particular age. So no matter how small the banking penetration was, it couldn't be compressed into one decade. And that is why we had a bad debt problem. What it led to was corporate balance sheets also were overstretched. Corporates had overborrowed because there was a lot of optimism about where India was heading. Therefore, there was multiple factors were at play, but even more, without attributing any malafide anywhere, you can simply say that there was overestimation, over-extrapolation of the growth prospects and their longevity. Naturally, therefore, investments went bad. So employment prospects also came down because manufacturing and manufacturing-oriented exports also languished. And post-2008, despite the rest of the world cutting interest rates down to zero in the US, Europe, and UK, Japan, Canada, etc., somehow global growth and global trade did not pick up as much as we would have liked it to. So apart from technological factors, which always compete with labor, what is the capital labor share of GDP is always an eternal question. And people, as they say in society, what is the golden rule? The one who has the goal makes the rule. That's the golden rule. So in that sense, capitalists have the capital, and therefore they decide how much they want to deploy capital, how much they decide to deploy labor. And sometimes you also compete in international markets, so you're forced to follow international trends to keep your costs low. It may come in the way of hiring because productivity typically of a machine is much more than that of a man, etc., and so on and so forth. So in the second decade, we had a problem with balance sheet repair in banks and the corporate sector, which was one of the factors, apart from technological changes that were happening, that led to a lower employment elasticity in India, in the manufacturing sector. As one would expect, India's agricultural employment was declining, which is what we all expect from a growing economy. transitioning from primary sector to secondary, secondary to tertiaries from 2006 onwards until 2019, agriculture was shedding jobs, manufacturing was not adding jobs, which means services was picking up all the surplus labor coming out of agriculture. Then came COVID. That lasted for 2 years. In general, you saw a lot of reverse migration as well happening from urban to rural because economic activity was restricted here. And more importantly, women in entered the labor force quite strongly and significantly in rural India in 1920, 2021, and so on. Now, in the last 3 years, employment has indeed begun to pick up. Now, why did I narrate to you in the last few minutes the story of the 2008 financial crisis and the banking crisis that followed, and then the COVID? So when we analyze whether the Indian economy is creating adequate jobs or not, we should not lose sight of the fact that we have come out of 2 successive shocks, both of which were fairly significant. One of which lasted nearly a decade to clean up, which is the banking asset problem and the financial sector problem. And the second, of course, is a once-in-a-century global pandemic, which many countries are still grappling with. Either it is the huge budget deficit, whether it is the huge corporate sector deficit, or high inflation, or lost years of schooling. We have some of these challenges, but luckily not all these challenges as many other countries are facing. Today, you look at the United States, for example, the budget deficit is 6.7% of GDP in 2024, even after 3 years after the COVID ended. And naturally, that has got its own implications. So whether or not India has become structurally different when it comes to creating jobs cannot be understood without accepting the big role played by these 2 major shocks, the banking crisis and the pandemic shock. Because many other factors that influence employment generation, which is technological change and culture and the attitude towards entrepreneurship, etc., they exist at all times. Those are common factors across societies, across countries, over time. But these were 2 specific idiosyncratic shocks. The NPA shock was very unique to India at that time. And of course, the pandemic was not unique to India, but nonetheless, given our size, we have a big impact. 2021 GDP fell 5.8%. So therefore, I feel a structural pessimism on India's employment generation capability is not warranted because we need to separate these 2 temporary shocks from the structural drivers. The second point is, post-COVID, the Indian corporate sector has recovered very, very well. In September 2019, they got a tax cut, but even without the tax cut, profits before tax of India's corporate sector, and I covered it in the economic survey, was 5.3 lakh crore rupees in 1920. According to the Center for Monitoring Indian Economy, about a sample of 30,000 plus companies, their profitability was 5.3 lakh crores. In FY23, March 23, unless you have read the economic survey, you may not remember the number. What is likely to have been the profit before tax of this sample of 30,000 plus companies? FY20, I gave you a number, 5.3 lakh crores. What would have been the number in FY23, 3 years later? Any guess? Huh? Okay, so you probably read the economic survey, but the number was 20.6 lakh crores from 5.3. In 3 years, it went up nearly 4 times. 4 times would be 21.2. Right? So, and this includes financial companies also, which means banks. Banks have recovered post the non-performing crisis of the second decade. But take out the banks, it was 3x. 3x in 3 years is also still a great number. So clearly, COVID also gave an opportunity for the corporate sector, whether it is financial or non-financial, to reduce costs, partly by changing the composition of labor. And that is what we need to study. Did COVID by any chance contribute to actually a return to informalization of the labor force? That is something we need to get more data and see if that happened. Because this phenomena of gig workers is something that we need to understand a lot more. If so, we need to address it because it does lead to certain lack of protection, social security, etc. Because evidently the corporate sector is doing very well. I mean, if you look at the headlines in the course of June, you would have seen that the Indian corporate sector profits at a 15-year high, and the financial sector, banks, net interest margin, that is the gap between the interest they receive minus the interest they pay for their funding, net interest margin is also at a 10 to 12-year high. So evidently, financial and non-financial sector companies are doing well. See, whether a company hires workers on a full-time basis or even whether they hire workers from a staffing company, these people are eligible for full range of protection, payment by check, employee state insurance corporation enrollment, provident fund, gratuity, leave, maternity benefits, etc. But if you're hired as a gig worker, then you don't get all these benefits. So the question is, we need to ask ourselves, has there been a shift once again? While we were getting formalized, while we are bringing many companies, small, medium, micro, into the formal sector so that they get access to finance, etc. But in the process, has the labor force post-COVID especially, has it become more informal rather than becoming more formal? If so, that is something that we need to study. And that is why this budget probably has spent a lot of time focusing on 3 different kinds of incentives, whether in manufacturing, whether you are a first-time worker, and if you are hiring in bulk. For every one of them, the budget tries to provide some reduction in cost, either through reduction in the contribution of provident fund or the first 1 month of wages, etc. Several incentives are being sought to be given. That is one part. The second part is, of course, the training part, which is the in a hub and spoke model, revamp 1,000 industrial training institutes, ITIs, etc. But sometimes we also have to take a look at 2 iron laws of public policy, which is, one is that there is always a law of unintended consequences, and the second law of public policy is that the road to hell is paved with good intentions. And just a couple of days ago in the United States, there was a paper that's been released based on a pilot study done in 2 states. I forget which states they are. And they are showing that something similar to a universal basic income, which was implemented in those states, actually led to a lower willingness on the part of the labor to offer their supply. In other words, you are happy with what you are getting in terms of the payment. You don't want to. So when you talk of unemployment, you must also try to find out how much of it is involuntary, how much of it is voluntary unemployment. So when we try to give support, this is something that is very well known in Europe. In fact, the Europeans had such a very extensive welfare system that there have been studies already done in the 1990s and 2000s that spoke about their impact on willingness to work or willingness to offer oneself for paid employment. If you are going to get 80% of your wages for 3 years, and then that is when they brought in some kind of term limits on some of those benefits, etc. So that is the other part we need to study. One part I mentioned was we should not consider this as a structural problem, given the 2 shocks we faced. The second point I alluded to was whether post-COVID there is a tendency towards informalization. And the third part is whether some of the well-intended benefit schemes and welfare schemes have a certain behavioral consequence in terms of willingness to offer the supply of labor on the part of the youth. The last point I would make is when it comes to skilling and training, and I think they pointed out that agriculture isn't something that many youth are considering as their preferred vocation. I can understand that because it is associated with some sort of it's considered a boring activity, because in general, food, at some point after you become more and more developed, your share of food consumption doesn't increase proportionately. The type of food you increase will change: more protein, more fat, more meat, or even you consume more leisure. You will expand your wardrobe, consumer durables, etc. But naturally, food as a share of your expenditure will not rise proportionately. That is why in the consumer price index for developing countries, food constitutes 40 to 50%. In developed countries, it constitutes between 10 and 20% at most in the consumer price index basket, because ultimately, you eat maximum of 3 meals. That you can't increase it just because you become richer now. You don't eat 5 meals a day or 7 meals a day. It doesn't happen. So, in general, therefore, agriculture, people know that they feel it is not a sunrise industry because there is a certain cap to it naturally as you become developed. That doesn't mean, while a share of GDP goes down, it doesn't mean that it becomes less important or less consequential. Ultimately, it is a necessary input for our survival. But more importantly, in today's world, and that is where, institutions like this and even policymakers or the private sector must think about is agriculture something that we need not to consign it as an industry or a vocation of the past, but actually a vocation of the future? Why? Look at the way the world is changing, because today the Indian services sector, which is a success story, especially IT-enabled services, could be threatened if artificial intelligence lives up to its hype, which is not yet, of course, proven. But if it does live up to its hype, it could easily replace low-end IT-enabled services in India. So therefore, while some highly skilled youth may be able to participate still and coexist with AI or even take advantage of it, and some of the global capability centers could be still thriving in the presence of AI, many other services which were outsourced to India could very easily be done by AI in the respective host countries instead of the work being shipped to India. So that is one possibility. Low-end IT-enabled services may come under threat. Second aspect when it comes to manufacturing, and this is what the survey talks about as well, is that you have a looming presence of China. I mean, back in the 1960s and 70s, when the rest of East Asia, like Japan and then Singapore, Taiwan, Hong Kong, Korea, grew and became developed countries in one generation, they did not have the size and the scale that China has today, which they have spent 30 years building up, so much so that they are indispensable in anything. In fact, one of my good friends, Mr. Neelkan Mishra of the Axis Bank, he wrote an article about a couple of weeks ago. I think you could search for it. China plus one equals China. And there is a message in that, right? I mean, you can't, if you want to plug yourself into the global supply chain, you first have to plug yourself into China's supply chain or plug China into your supply chain before you consider becoming part of the global supply chain for manufactured goods. That's a reality. Or for that matter, you take energy transition, renewable energy, electric vehicles. You depend on inputs from China, whether it is graphite, whether it is lithium, nickel, or for that matter, silicon wafer or silicon wafer making equipment. If you look at the trade components of India's bilateral trade deficit with China, we import a lot of capital goods, not final goods, capital goods, without which you can't produce. So, in other words, manufacturing forever faces this looming presence of China. And this is a problem, again, not just faced by India, but faced by many countries, except that we have a population which is far bigger in the world, biggest in the world. So in that sense, the scope of the problem is much more gigantic for us. And other countries might say, well, they had their heyday in the past in manufacturing. UK or the US or continental Europe or Canada, and today they might have lost it to China and they may be trying to reclaim it back. But whereas we never had a heyday in manufacturing. In the 60s and 70s, we lacked the infrastructure, and many of our manufacturing enterprises were hobbled by government rules and regulations and restrictions. And now today we have created the physical infrastructure quite a bit, still a long way to go, but clearly there is advancement visible to our eyes. And at the same time, we also have sort of addressed the ease of doing business. Again, a lot of work that remains to be done, but much visible progress is there. In spite of all of that, simultaneously, the presence of China has expanded. The second reason also we need to think about manufacturing and services, whether will they be as strong drivers of growth as we would like them to be, is because post 2016, post-COVID, the number of trade restrictions, formal and informal, tariff and non-tariff, have expanded like anything. So trade restrictions have proliferated across the world. And therefore, global trade is going to be not as strong as it was growing before 2008. So we had our golden era of globalization. People who studied economic history would say the golden era of globalization was 1885 to 1914, pre-World War I, and also between 1980 and about 2008, until the global financial crisis happened. Maybe if you want to stretch it until 2015, about 35 years. So you have a problem with global trade growth, you have a looming presence of China, you have the invasion of artificial intelligence as a technology, And of course, global politics is very fragmented, multiple groups, multiple blocks, and we do not know when any one of this conflict becomes much more widespread and enduring, as some of them have already turned out to be. One is more than 2 years old, one is almost more than 9 months old now, etc. So, and given all this, we don't have the luxury of excluding any sector as our contributor to growth. And that is what I'm coming to, which is to say that therefore agriculture should actually be an engine of growth as well. That productivity global average, let alone global best. And there are value added related to agriculture, storage, cold chain storage, whether it is processing, whether it is diversification into cash crops. I mean, today there's an article in Mint about how tur dal, production is declining, and the net irrigated area dedicated to tur dal is extremely low, and it's dependent on monsoon. Look at the monsoon performance this year so far until August 5th. You have 36 monsoon subdivisions, only about 14 normal, the balance 22, either excess or deficit. And normal itself is considered to be plus or minus 19% on either side. So if you have to be in excess, it should be lower than 19%. And if it is excess, it is more than 19% excess. Both of them are not good for your crop yield. Therefore, what are the things we can do to restore our water resilience? All these activities are actually can be very exciting, and they are the founding pillars and foundations of society to thrive. I mean, you may be able to thrive without technology, but you cannot thrive without water, and civilizations have perished because of water. So in that sense, the fundamental basis and the fundamental justification or rationale for agriculture cannot be overstated in a world which is marred by political developments and marred by rapid technological change and the presence of a very large manufacturing player like China, etc. Therefore, agriculture has to be brought back into fashion. And if people say we are open to being persuaded, provided we are handheld and we are given some technical support, that is where I think, not-for-profit organizations, academic institutions, and even industry have to collaborate together. Okay. And then even for entrepreneurship, there were some comments made here in the survey saying that, look, give us some training, because this is not something my forefathers and grandfathers and fathers did. And even with entrepreneurs who already are in business, what you realize is that they don't need formal education for 2 years. They don't need an MBA. They just need to know, because most of them know their customer. They have inherited the business from their parents and the grandparents. So they know the market, they know the product very well, more than anybody else does. What they need is, how do I distinguish between my capital and the business's capital? How to separate the two finances? And what does it mean to reduce my working capital by 1 day or 2 days? What does it mean? How does it translate into saved interest cost? And human resource management, motivating, hiring, retaining people, etc. Those are all the areas in which they need focused, tailor-made training. And if those kinds of training are given, it need not be for 6 months. It could be even for 1 week, or it could be 2 weeks, or 1 or 2 months spread over the weekends or whatever. The payoff for such training is manifold. The multiplier effect of such training is like equal to the profit growth I showed you about. I talked to you about the corporate sector's profit growth. It could be 3x, 4x kind of benefit. So in that sense, the picture of India's employment, and we in the economic survey also talk about the amount of jobs we need to create every month, every year. We estimated it. The calculations are put in the public domain. You can download the spreadsheet, look at assumptions, and you can impute your own assumptions and come to your own conclusions. But we have stated how we got our numbers. We think it's about 8 million jobs a year. And based on data that we have, we believe post-COVID, that many jobs are being created. But the question is, what kind of quality of jobs? Are they gig workers? Are they informalized work or more formal work? That is what we are also trying to gather more data and talk to the corporates. That is why the economic survey says, going forward, we need a compact. We need a compact or an agreement, grand bargain, so to speak, between industry, government, and there the word government stands for governments around the country, local, state, and the union, not just one governments in Delhi, and academia in terms of preparing the youth. So what should governments do? Ultimately, this may sound like a philosophical statement, but it is a practical statement. Each one of us, when it comes to GDP growth or employment generation, cannot control the ultimate outcome because it is a function of technological change, cultural change, people's attitudes, willingness to offer their services to work, etc., which you cannot control. But what can governments around the country do? Deregulate. Lift the heavy hand of the rules and regulations and compliance on our businesses, especially small and medium and micro. And we have given some examples in the economic survey. The kind of restrictions we impose on our businesses about the amount of space you need to allocate for parking, the amount of space you need to allocate per worker, the four sides of a building, of an area, land area, the setbacks we need to allow. If you take away all of that, a business is left with about 20 to 40% of the land space to build the factory. And this is based on the work by similar enterprising outfits such as yours, called Prosperity with Ends with the I. And they looked at 10 states and they found that the state of Haryana has slightly more progressive rules in this regard. And even if the rest of the country moves towards Haryana levels, the amount of land that will be released for actual factory building will be much more, in which case the per unit cost of production will go down. And entrepreneurs will hire more people. So each outfit, each entity in this compact, in this grand agreement, in private sector and government, must think about what that they can do. Government's point of view, it's about especially at the local and state government level. What I call the LIC, divesting from the real LIC. The real LIC is licensing, inspection, and compliance. That is the real LIC. That is the real divestment that needs to happen. And from the industry side, they need to ask themselves, it may be good enough for me to generate profits by substituting capital for labor. But in the medium run, I need society to be stable and I need to generate the demand, the purchasing power in the people. Without that, I'm not going to be able to survive with my profits. So there is the horizon that needs to be kept in mind. What is the relevant horizon for my profits optimization? It is next 2 years, 3 years, or 5 years, or much longer. And social stability is a sine qua non for your commercial success. So that is the and willingness to invest in R&D, research and development. These are the asks, or these are the things that the industry must ponder about. And academia is always about collaborating with the industry, collaborating with economic agents, and making yourself relevant, especially from the point of view of livelihood generation in the country. And what about the people themselves? Understand how the world is evolving and not have preconceived notions of which sectors I want to participate in, and be able to appreciate where the opportunities lie. And today, for example, in Brazil, I understand that the youth are taking to agriculture in a much more rapid way than they were used to. So agriculture or farming has become fashionable in Brazil. That is what we need to find out, how they are doing it and what is it that we can replicate if we can. Okay. And more importantly, the youth of the country also must keep themselves in good health, physical health, because we ignore the micro determinants of productivity. We always speak about macro determinants, technology, skilling, and automation, and about education. All these things are fine. And then, deregulation, liberalization, tax laws, etc. All that is fine. But micro determinants of productivity are equally important. One of the most important micro determinants is physical health. And whether screen time, sedentary activity, junk food consumption, all these things are going to impact the demographic dividend. So, therefore, we have a very unique set of opportunity and a unique set of challenges in this country. The challenge may appear daunting, but let's not forget that we are attempting an extraordinary transformation of a country, which is obviously a subcontinent. And you can see that. I mean, each state, if you map it to another country with a similar population, you have 28 different countries packed inside this country. And all of them have their own unique set of problems. And we have all the accumulation of all these challenges, and we are attempting this transformation within a democratic framework. And our per capita income went from 6,000 rupees in 1990 to 2.12 lakh rupees in 2023. 24 March in the 30 financial years. In dollar terms, it went from $348 to $2,500 in these 30 years. So you might say, well, China grew around the same number, 348 to about $12,000 or $13,000 as they went on to become an $18 trillion economy. You're at $3.6 trillion. We understand that. But we should also remember that per dollar of debt, India has generated more GDP than China has, which means it is always possible to juice up your economic growth, or if you're an investor in the financial markets, you can juice up your returns by taking on more debt, more leverage. But ultimately, you have to pay it back. So in that sense, we have been more efficient in utilizing capital. So that is why you just can't compare absolute numbers. And apart from maintaining physical health, etc., well, education, skilling, and all these things are important, we should also become students. Whether or not you are a formal student of economics, you must also be a student of economic history in general, regardless of whether economics is your discipline or not. Because ultimately, we in our societies, in our civilizations, we believe in circularity and not in linearity. What goes around comes around, and things come back in cycles. Okay, so in that sense, sometimes if you study history, it is not just about the classroom exercise, but it is something that repeats in different ways. So history may not repeat, as I say, at least it rhymes. So in that sense, we need to appreciate the context in which the world is going towards in the next 25, 30 years, and accordingly modulate and moderate our expectations and also be more prepared. And some of us who do this should therefore have the responsibility of sharing it with the rest of the public who may or may not be inclined so. So these are my thoughts. Thank you very much for listening to me. I hope it has been a worthwhile exercise for you.
Would you like to have? Yeah. Wow. I feel like I've just had a fabulous big lunch of brain food. I don't even know where to begin. I'm not going to attempt to summarize everything because you did such a wonderful job as an economist, talking in very real terms that I think most of us understood so well. So thank you for being such a fabulous communicator. It was great to have a little dive back into 2008 and the sort of the trauma of that, and look at the shock of that and COVID, and go back into history a little and get that. I liked a lot of your pithy phrases too, with the road to hell is paved with good intentions, and but the add-on that you gave to that. I think it was so great, though, particularly for those of us in this room, to hear you say that while agriculture is a sunrise industry, it is not inconsequential. And that because we have an expanding presence of China, that is why we shouldn't write off agriculture. And you gave some wonderful advice about what we need to do as a society and as different organizations, building government, building strengths to do that. So I would, there's so much more I could say. I really enjoyed hearing this, and I'm sure that there's a lot of people that want to ask questions too. So if there are people that have questions, and maybe we can have someone from our team take microphones around. Raise your hand for those who have questions. I know we have a question over here and in the back probably. Who has a question that wants to go first? And question being the operative word, more than, of course, a monologue. So who would like to take the first question? Okay, over here. Why don't you?
So I'll just ask here, so thank you very much. It was very insightful, and by the time people are digesting and coming up with questions, I wanted to ask, you talked very nicely about, the global fracturing that is happening, the geopolitical issues that are happening. And that's why the globalization era that was there is not probably going to look like the same in the next few years. But I guess if India has to create opportunities at scale for young people entering the workforce every year, and we understand manufacturing and services is an important sector of the economy. So given the current, geopolitical issues with China rising, a lot of trade restrictions coming in, what are the challenges that you see that India is not able to so far take advantage of these challenges, and what India can do more to take advantages of supply chain moving away from China, as you have said, just in time replacing just in case. So what just in case replacing just in time. So what can be done by India to take that opportunity and also attract more investment? So we have seen investment-led models.
So sort of a multi-layered question. Thank you. I think many of the things that we have been doing in the last several years are clearly meant to address the questions you asked. How do we participate in the globalized economy? How do we raise our share of manufacturing in the Indian economy? How do we plug ourselves into global supply chain? And more importantly, how we build our own domestic supply chain resilience? These are the questions that are being addressed. So, for example, many people think that India experienced premature deindustrialization, but I'm one of the few who think we never industrialized enough because we lacked the infrastructure. So the biggest deficiency that was there was the absence of adequate physical infrastructure, and that is being addressed, whether you look at the road length or installed generation of electricity capacity, whether it is the number of airports, which doubled in 8 years compared to what we built in the first 67 years, etc., since independence. So those are all the markers. And apart from the digital infrastructure that has now become a pretty important achievement of India, built on Aadhaar and built on financial inclusion, Jan Dhan Yojana, etc. So what more needs to happen is clearly, that is exactly what my remarks were about. I think the private sector has to invest in more in long-term research. If you look at it, in fact, we have a research from Ernst & Young, I think, which shows that actually in terms of fiscal and other incentives, the governments in India have not been very stingy in incentivizing R&D, but the private sector has been relatively found wanting in terms of taking it up and doing fundamental research. So that's why I said the important thing is we need longer term thinking and longer term horizons on the part of the private sector. On the part of the public or the youth bulge, we basically need a mindset of continuous learning. And I think that is required. And as far as the governments are concerned, I spelled out the more important thing is to let go, deregulate. I think that is still the case, whether it is a tax or non-tax administration, to make it uniform, predictable, transparent, and stable, more importantly. And when it comes to farming sector, in fact, Chapter 5 of the Economic Survey does have a special 4-pager, a box item, so to speak, on what can we do to make farming more productive and more remunerative and a worthwhile activity for farmers. So there are many suggestions that are there in Chapter 5 of the Economic Survey. Related to your question.
Thank you very much. Do we have another question?
I mean, at least, see, ultimately, like in everything else in life, it's about finding the right balance between the two. So, for example, when we impose, effectively, the answer is, do we have when it comes to non-financial sector, because when it comes to financial sector, it's a completely different story in my view, because I've been in that sector, and the book, The Rise of Finance, Causes, Consequences, and Cure, which I wrote about, I believe that the financial sector, if you regulate it on a principle basis, they end up running rings around regulators. Okay, so that's separate. But when it comes to non-financial sector, manufacturing or services, principle-based regulation, rather than being extremely prescriptive, will be helpful. And I think we still are extremely prescriptive, whether it is state or local governments, etc. Because that is one of the things we have mentioned in the economic survey. Many of the low-hanging fruits of economic liberalization have been plucked already at the union government level. Much more needs to happen at the subnational government level, state and local. And in fact, that is why we say the mantra for the next 10, 20 years is grunt work. Grunt work. getting into the nuts and bolts and the plumbing of governance. Now, whether specifically with respect to ESG or shop floor safety, etc., yes, of course, many things cannot be, nobody is saying you can't have an overarching framework. And nobody is saying that you should not be insisting on certain minimum standards of workplace safety, occupational hazards being minimized, etc., and stable working conditions. But ultimately, it's about the intrusive nature of it, the extreme intricate levels of prescriptive rules, even to the extent of saying you must have X amount of square feet in your business allocated to receiving inventory, X square feet of space allocated to production, and a Y square feet allocated to finished goods inventory. That is something that you know based on your business, your turnover, how much of volume you handle, etc. So that is one example of the level of prescription to which our rules and regulations and laws go. So it's about finding the right balance, as with everything else in life.
Okay, I think you were first, and then I'll go over there. Just there.
I have a hard stop at 5, so the shorter the question, the more we can accommodate.
Okay, 10 minutes, short questions, and
yeah. Hi, thank you. So you briefly spoke about, the unintended consequences of welfare schemes. Can you give more insights on that? And moving forward, how do you see, should there be a sort of, reworking on how policies are framed? Should there be some sort of, separate sort of approach? So, okay.
I don't have any more insight to offer except to say that the same old truth. Sometimes we do many of these things with very good intentions, but the behavioral signals that they send are very different. And I just gave the example of a pilot study done in the 2 US states, etc. And I also cited the example of what happened in Europe, etc., which is why we talk about erosclerosis and a structural level of unemployment in the US, in Europe being higher than the structural level of unemployment in the US, etc. And also partly explaining the difference in entrepreneurialism between the two continents. Okay, so I have nothing more to add except to say that when we design these things, we must think about eligibility conditions, sunset clause, sunset terminal dates. And eventually the idea is it's all about empowerment versus entitlement, enabling. That's why I began by saying, ultimately, it's about enabling people to participate in economic activity. Economic activity happens outside the government, not inside the government. And that is what we should be facilitating with our welfare schemes or non-welfare schemes as well. And hold it for 2 seconds, then it works. Here it's working. Yeah.
I was just affirming to sir both the economic survey and your talk here. Few things that we do at TRI, sir. One is on the agriculture. We are looking at it in a more not one of past, which actually one of our colleagues says it is what he described as BNK, Bhuka Nanga Kheti, where you have to be on sweat and just keep working on. So if you start moving ahead, bringing more mechanization, high value agriculture, linking it with secondary agriculture opportunities, that's what at TRI we do 2 programs of ours. One is the Millennium Farmer Development Program in Jharkhand on a very large scale, where technology is the driver of, you alluded to the productivity gaps, there is a headroom there. So that is one. The other is the program, sir, we have worked with the Ministry of Rural Development around Lakpati Didi. Again, we have looked at mass scale diversification. We are involved with the Ministry of Rural Development around that. The second, sir, you talked about the first gen entrepreneurs and what they need in terms of small bite-size nano inputs. Again, that is a program actually, as you came to the slide that was on with Anu, with the Global Opportunity Youth Network. So what we are doing is at the district level, we are creating an anchorage. And the other thing that we are trying to do is bringing, sir, because it is fragmented, MSDE, MSME, MORD, and what have you, so agriculture. So we are trying to converge it at the district level, and we have created, again, building from Potter's framework of, we have created a district livelihood opportunity matrix, and there we are certainly doing all these training. And what we say is, if you wish to move out of agriculture, do some business, it should be a wish away. So within 10-20 villages, we have established a digital hub which provides this foundational learning opportunities and also linkage opportunities. The last one, sir, you flagged about EODB and the way you talk about the role of local government, district governments. Again, we have done One of our sister concern is National Association of Pharma Organizations, NAPO, sir. We have done a state ranking of EODB for FPO business, sir. And we will be sharing it with you. So we are working with the Ministry of Agriculture around that. One thing that you really talked about, the compact, the new compact between the corporate government and academia. So the foundational work of TRI is creating a compact at the locality level, sir, where we look at panchayats, the women collectives and other community collectives, sir, in the private voluntary organizations, as Tocco below would have put it. So at one end that, the constitutional local governance structure and the front line of local government. It could be AAA in health, it could be school teacher in education. So bringing all of them together around solving local problems and taking charge of the issues, the aspirations that the communities have. And again, we had very rich dividends. We'll be happy to share with you around that, sir. And I must compliment you, sir, on this issue that you brought very beautifully in the economic survey, also the question of the morbidity and how we need to look at, when we look at workforce, we need to look at the underlying subclinical morbidity there. And that's where if they have to, sell away their labor, we have to ensure that they are. So I just thought I'll just affirm that.
Thank you.
Shakti, you had, yeah.
Will not say controlling, but intervening in agricultural sector, sometimes distort the market and all. How you suggest to an enterprising youth who is trying to enter in agriculture and development that government should not get out of it because it is helping lots of poor farmers, but certainly provide some impetus to the enterprising.
That's a fair point, and that's exactly what answering the very first question. To respond, the box item in chapter 5 on what are the intelligent ways in which we can actually make farming remunerative and profitable is addressing many of your questions. So yes, you have to be pro-farmer, but being pro-farmer in a very smart way in enabling them to take advantage of international terms of trade, giving them a stable and a predictable environment, frequent imports or frequent export bans or interfering with distorting prices, etc. So we have gone into some detail in those 4 pages, and that should give the answer. And then, for example, he mentioned in his remarks about productivity and mechanization. That again is a state government level activity because the average size of Indian farm holding has come down from 2.8 hectares in 1970s to 1.08 hectares. And 86% of them are below 2 hectares. And international studies have shown that you need at least 4 hectares of land to be able to profitably deploy technology and mechanization. So land consolidation again is in a state level activity. So we have touched upon many of these things. But that could go a long way in making farming an attractive proposition for our youth.
Thank you so much for your insights. I was going to try and squeeze in another question. Can I squeeze in one or should we? Yes. Okay. One quick one.
So as an economist, what would you say are the 3 to 4 things that we can do to increase economic opportunity at the district, and then also map at some level the gross district product to see if there's macro level shifts?
I think towards the end of my this kind of question definitely requires some thinking, and I don't want to give without not well thought through kind of answer. But I kind of alluded to what an economist can do is about understanding being wedded to a particular school of economics or ideology in a rapidly changing global environment is not necessarily going to pay dividends. So, and we mentioned it in the economic survey, neither capitalism nor socialism, but pragmatism is what is going to help us. And therefore, understanding context, understanding history, and some situations may require you to say markets can do the job. Some situations you may be required to say, no, government has to play a leading role. So to be able to have that intellectual open mind and to be able to convey that to the non-economist audience is the best service you can do.
What a great place to end it on. Thank you. And another pithy phrase from you that we will be quoting, I'm sure. Let's have a round of applause, please, for our keynote speaker, Dr. Nagarajan. Thank you so much, sir. I think we have a quick little thank you from TRI before you leave. Please. Thank you so much for your time. Really appreciate it. Very.